There are towns that wear their cruelty openly, like a scar on the face of a man who doesn't bother to explain how he got it. Ash Hollow, Nebraska Territory, was one of those towns. It sat at the bottom of a long, descending trail carved by 10,000 wagon wheels. The same trail that had swallowed entire families whole during the Great Migration West. The same trail where cholera had killed so many travelers that their graves lined the hillsides like fence posts. The town had grown out of that suffering, quietly and without apology, and something of that original grief had soaked into the soil and stayed there. By the autumn of 1873, Ash Hollow had a population of 412 souls, depending on who you counted and what your definition of a soul was. There was a general store, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse when Judge Hallett was sober enough to hold proceedings, a livery stable that smelled like everything you'd expect, and one church, white-painted clapboard with a bell tower that leaned slightly southwest, as though even the building itself was trying to leave. Most people who passed through Ash Hollow on their way somewhere else looked at it and kept moving. The ones who stayed were the ones who had no better option. Elara Whitmore had been born here, which meant she had never been given a choice in the matter at all. She was 23 years old on the morning of October the 4th, and she stood in the back room of the church dressed in a gown that did not belong to her. The dress had been provided by Silas Crow, which told you everything you needed to know about the situation. It was expensive, cream-colored silk with pearl buttons running up the back from the base of her spine to the nape of her neck, and it fit her the way expensive things often fit women in her position, technically correct, deeply uncomfortable, and clearly chosen by someone who cared more about what she would look like than how she would feel. The mirror on the wall was cracked in the upper left corner. Elara had been staring at that crack for the better part of 20 minutes because it was easier than looking at her own face. Behind her, in the doorway, stood Mrs. Grundy, a woman of 60 with the narrow eyes of someone who had long ago decided that other people's suffering was simply the natural order of things. "You ought to be fixing your hair," Mrs. Grundy said. "My hair is fine. It's loose on the left side." "I know." Mrs. Grundy made a sound that was not quite disapproval and not quite sympathy, but lived somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. She had been appointed to accompany Elara this morning by Silas Crow himself, which meant she was less a bridesmaid and more a guard wearing a church dress. Elara understood this. She didn't bother pretending otherwise. "Your father sends his regards," Mrs. Grundy said. Elara said nothing. "He's sitting in the front pew. He's wearing his good jacket." "His good jacket?" Elara repeated the words slowly, tasting how hollow they were. Her father's good jacket. The man was selling his daughter to pay off his own debts, and he'd put on his good jacket for the occasion. She pressed her fingers flat against the windowsill and looked out through the wavy glass at the street below. It was early, not yet 9 in the morning, but a crowd had already gathered on the wooden sidewalks across from the church. They stood in clusters of 2 and 3, not talking much, watching the church doors the way people watch a storm rolling in from the west. They knew something significant was happening. Whether it was a wedding or a transaction depended on which side of town you lived on. 5 minutes, Mrs. Grundy said, and withdrew. Elara had not cried this morning. She'd made a decision about that sometime around 3 a.m. Mossy, lying in the dark on the narrow cot in the back of her father's store, listening to the wind move through the gaps in the wall. She had given herself until midnight to feel whatever she needed to feel. The grief, the fury, the particular kind of helplessness that comes from being a woman in a time and place that did not give women many legal avenues of resistance. She'd felt all of it, alone in the dark. And then she'd folded it away. She would not give Silas Crow the satisfaction of seeing her cry. What she felt now, standing in the borrowed dress in the cracked mirror of a leaning church, was something colder and more dangerous than grief. It was the specific clarity that comes when a person has run out of options and started, very quietly, considering ones that hadn't existed before. The back room had one door, the one Mrs. Grundy had just exited through, leading into the main hall of the church. It also had a window. The window was not large, but Elara was not a large woman. She looked at it. She looked at the door. She thought about her father's good jacket. Then she pressed both hands to the window frame and began to push. To understand why Elara Whitmore was climbing out of a church window on her wedding morning, you need to understand something about her father. Samuel Whitmore had been, in better years, a decent man with decent instincts and a particularly catastrophic relationship with his own ambition. He'd come west in 1858 with a young wife, a wagon full of dry goods, and the unshakable conviction that Ash Hollow was going to be the next great crossroads town, that the trail traffic would keep growing, that a smart man who got in early could build something lasting. The wife had died of fever in 1862, leaving Samuel with a 6-year-old daughter and a store that needed running. He'd kept the store open. He'd kept Elara fed and clothed and in school as long as there was a school to go to. He wasn't a cruel man. He wasn't even a careless one, not exactly. He simply had a weakness for believing things would get better on their own, and for borrowing money against that belief. By 1870, Samuel Whitmore owed Silas Crow $4,200. By 1872, that number had become $6,800. By the autumn of 1873, Silas Crow sat across Samuel's counter one Tuesday morning and laid out the situation plainly. The store, the land the store sat on, and everything in it would become Crow's property before the end of the month, unless they could arrive at an alternative arrangement. Samuel Whitmore had looked at his hands. He'd looked at the counter. He'd looked briefly toward the back of the store where Elara was inventorying bolts of calico. What kind of arrangement? He'd asked. That was the question that had started all of this. Silas Crow was 51 years old, and he had the body of a man who had been powerful once and had since gone to fat without quite losing the threat underneath it. He was broad through the shoulders and thick in the neck, with hands that looked like they'd been designed for a larger species. His hair was iron gray and well kept. He dressed expensively, in suits that came from Kansas City. He had been married once before to a woman named Clara, who had died in childbirth 8 years prior. And in the years since he had moved through Ash Hollow, like a man who had decided that the rules of ordinary society were courtesies extended to people who couldn't afford to ignore them. He owned the largest cattle operation in 100 miles. He owned 2 of the 3 largest ranches in the surrounding territory. He had arrangements with the local law that could generously be called informal, and less generously called something that would get you sued. He wanted Elara Whitmore the way certain men want things they've decided they deserve. Completely, and without particular interest in whether the thing in question agreed. When people in town asked, quietly, among themselves, why Elara didn't simply refuse, the question revealed something about how much those people understood about the mechanics of poverty and power. Elara's refusal would mean her father's immediate ruin. The store would close. Samuel Whitmore, at 58, with bad knees and no other trade, would have nothing. They would have nothing, and Silas Crow had made it clear, in the quiet and particular way he communicated important information, that this would also not be the end of the matter. So Elara had said yes. Or rather, she had not said no. In the world she occupied, these were sometimes the same thing. She had spent the months since the engagement being measured for that dress, and smiling in the appropriate directions, and thinking very carefully about what yes actually meant, and whether there was any version of the future in which it could mean something else. She had not found one. Until this morning, when she decided to stop looking for a version and start making one. The window was painted shut. This was a problem. Elara pressed against the frame with both palms, then her forearms, feeling the paint resist and crack in places but hold in others. The wood was old and swollen from autumn damp. She had, she estimated, about 4 minutes before Mrs. Grundy returned, and the window was not cooperating. She looked around the room. On a small table in the corner sat a Bible, a water basin, and a letter opener that one of the Sunday school teachers had apparently left behind. She took the letter opener and ran it along the edges of the window frame, breaking the paint seal in short, urgent strokes, trying not to make noise. Bits of white paint flaked onto her silk sleeve. She kept going. The window gave with a soft crack that sounded, in that small room, like a gunshot. Elara froze. From the main hall, she could hear the murmur of guests, the low conversation of people waiting for something to begin. No footsteps. No Mrs. Grundy. She lifted the window, felt the cold October air come in against her face, and looked down. 6 feet to the ground. Maybe 7. She was wearing a silk dress with a 6-foot train and boots with small heels that were absolutely not designed for jumping out of windows. She pulled the train up, tucked it into her waistband in a way that would have horrified anyone who cared about such things, sat on the sill, and dropped. She landed badly. Her left ankle turned on the uneven ground, and she grabbed the church wall to keep from going down completely. Pain flared up her leg. She bit it back, checked the ankle, sore but not broken, and looked up and down the narrow alley beside the church. Both ends opened onto streets. To her right was the main street where the crowd was gathered. To her left was a smaller lane that ran behind the livery stable and the feed mill toward the edge of town. She turned left and ran. Colt Mercer had arrived in Ash Hollow 4 days before the wedding, which was not a coincidence, though he hadn't known it at the time. He'd come because the trail north was starting to freeze and he needed to winter somewhere. And Ash Hollow was as somewhere as anything he'd passed in the last 3 weeks. He had $42 in his jacket pocket, a horse named Buckwheat who was getting too old for long rides but hadn't admitted it yet, and a general plan for life that could be summarized as keep moving until something gives you a reason to stop. He was 31 years old. He'd been a cowhand, a trail cook, a part-time deputy in a town called Perdition, Texas, that no longer existed, and briefly, very briefly, a man who thought he might settle down in Colorado with a woman named Helen who had subsequently and very reasonably married someone more reliable. He wasn't bitter about that. Helen had made the right call. Colt was, as more than one person had observed, a man who was easier to admire from a distance than to live with up close. He was sitting outside the livery stable on a crate, working some oil into his saddle and watching the distant church tower because the bell had started ringing about 20 minutes ago and he had nothing better to do when the woman came running around the corner of the feed mill. She was wearing a wedding dress, or what was left of one. The skirt was bunched up into her waistband in a way that suggested either a spectacularly unconventional fashion choice or a situation of some urgency. She was moving fast, with a slight hitch in her left step, and she was scanning the lane ahead of her with the eyes of someone calculating distances and exits. She hadn't seen him yet. He set down the saddle oil. She was past him by 2 steps before she registered his presence and stopped so abruptly she nearly fell. She spun to face him, and he got his first clear look at her. Dark hair half out of its pins, a smear of white paint on her left sleeve, jaw set hard, eyes that were not scared so much as making a rapid and unfavorable assessment of whether he was a problem. "I'm not going to stop you," he said. She stared at him. "Whatever you're running from," he said, "I'm not going to stop you. That's not my business." "You don't know who I'm running from." "No," he agreed, "but I know the look of someone who's made a decision and you've made a decision. I'm just sitting here." She looked at him for another moment, really looked, the way people look when they're trying to determine in under 5 seconds whether someone is dangerous. He held still and let her do it. "That your horse?" she asked, nodding at Buckwheat, who was tied to the post nearby and regarding the situation with the magnificent indifference of a horse who had seen too much. "It is." "Is it fast?" "Fast enough, not as fast as he used to be." "Are you for hire?" Colt tilted his head slightly. "For hire doing what exactly?" "I need to get out of this town." She said it quietly, with the kind of precision that comes from having rehearsed the sentence in your head many times and finally getting to say it out loud. "Right now, today. I need to get somewhere far enough that certain people will not immediately follow." Certain people. Silas Crow. He was quiet for a moment. He'd heard the name since arriving in Ash Hollow. You couldn't spend 4 days in this town without hearing it. It came up the way weather came up, as a fact of life and a source of inconvenience. "I see," he said. "Do you know who he is?" "I know enough." "Then you know what you'd be risking." "I do." He reached down, picked up the saddle oil, capped it, and set it aside. "What's your name?" "Elara Whitmore." "Colt Mercer." He stood up. "I don't have a spare horse." "I don't need a spare horse. I can ride behind you until we get somewhere I can figure something out." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him with those careful, measuring eyes, and he could see the effort it cost her. Not the asking, but the trusting. The specific bravery of asking help from a stranger when trusting strangers had probably not served her well. "Give me 1 hour," he said. She blinked. "What?" "Before you run. Give me 1 hour." He was already untying Buckwheat. "Can you get somewhere safe for an hour?" "What are you going to do in an hour?" He swung up into the saddle and looked down at her. "Something probably pretty stupid," he said. but it might actually work. Colt Mercer had saved $2,300 over the course of 11 years. This was not, by most standards, an impressive sum for 11 years of labor. But Colt had spent those years in places where saving money required genuine discipline, where the nearest saloon was also the nearest temptation, and where men who came in with wages often left without them. He'd been careful. He'd been patient. The $2,300 was supposed to be the down payment on a small spread he'd located north of Denver, 40 acres with a creek, a rundown house, and good grass. He'd shaken hands with the seller in August. He had until spring to produce the money. He thought about this on the ride to the bank. He thought about it again inside the bank, waiting for the manager, a thin man named Perkins, who smelled of bay rum, and whose eyes kept going to Colt's saddlebag with the calculating interest of a man trying to determine approximate amounts. He thought about it a third time, when the teller confirmed that Samuel Whitmore's outstanding debt to Silas Crow had been sold to the Ash Hollow Cattlemen's Cooperative, which was, in all but name, Silas Crow himself, and that the current balance was $2,140. He thought about the 40 acres north of Denver. He thought about the creek. He thought about the look on Elara Whitmore's face when she'd asked if he was for hire. Not the desperation, because she'd been holding that back too well. The thing underneath the desperation. The thing that looked like a woman who had already accepted defeat and was asking anyway, the way you ask for things you don't actually believe you're going to get. He put $2,140 on the counter. "I need a receipt," he said, "with the debt marked as paid in full, and I need it notarized." Perkins looked at the money. He looked at Colt. "This is highly irregular." "I know it is." "Mr. Crow is not going to be pleased." "I expect not." "He is a man who—" "Can I have the receipt, please?" Perkins was quiet for a moment. Then he began counting the money. He had 12 minutes left of the hour when he tied buckwheat outside the church. The wedding had started. He could hear the officiant's voice through the closed doors, the flat, official cadence of a man reading vows from a card. He stood on the bottom step with the notarized receipt in his breast pocket and took 3 seconds to acknowledge that this was, by any rational measure, a deeply questionable decision. Then he opened the doors and walked in. The church was full, nearly every seat taken. The town of Ash Hollow assembled in its good clothes to watch a transaction dressed up as a sacrament. They turned almost as one when the doors opened. The sound of conversation dropped away. At the altar, Silas Crow turned. He was exactly as Colt had pictured him, large, expensively dressed, and wearing the expression of a man who was not accustomed to interruptions. Beside him, the officiant had stopped mid-sentence. In the front pew, Samuel Whitmore was half risen from his seat, his face a complicated map of confusion and alarm. There was no one standing at the altar beside Crow. Colt registered this with something that was not quite relief. He'd half expected Elara to still be here, to have lost her nerve or been caught before she could get clear. The empty space where she would have stood told him she'd managed to stay out. "Good. Service is in progress," Crow said. His voice was flat and controlled and carrying enough warning that several people in the nearby pews shifted away from Colt slightly. "I can see that," Colt said. "I'll try to be quick." He walked up the center aisle. People turned as he passed, the way grass bends when wind moves through it. He was aware of how he must look, trail-worn, not particularly well-dressed, carrying himself with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. He stopped 10 feet from the altar. "Silas Crow," he said, "you hold a debt against Samuel Whitmore. Or you did, as of about 20 minutes ago." Crow's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "That's correct." Colt reached into his breast pocket and produced the receipt. He held it up, not handing it over, just letting it be visible. "You don't anymore. Debts paid in full. Notarized this morning by Clarence Perkins at the Ash Hollow Territorial Bank." The silence in the church was the specific kind of silence that happens when a room full of people all stop breathing at the same moment. Crow's face did not change. Or rather, it changed in a way that was more alarming than if it had stayed the same. The surface went smooth and still, the way water goes smooth over a deep current. "That debt," he said carefully, "was the basis of our arrangement." "I know what it was the basis of," Colt said. "That's why I paid it." "You." Crow looked at him. You paid $2,000 for a woman you've never met. $2,140, Colt said. And I met her this morning. From the front pew, Samuel Whitmore made a sound that was hard to categorize. Somewhere between relief and devastation, the sound of a man watching a problem be solved in a way that implicated him in having created it. You have no legal claim, Colt said. The debt is satisfied. The arrangement is void. Crow was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to make several people near the back of the church decide they needed to find positions closer to the exits. You're a stranger in this town, Crow said. That's true. You don't know what you've walked into. I'm getting a sense of it. I would think very carefully, Crow said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and considerably more dangerous, about where you plan to be sleeping tonight. Colt folded the receipt and put it back in his pocket. I appreciate the advice, he said. Then he turned around and walked back out the way he'd come. He found Elara behind the feed mill, sitting on an upturned crate with her skirt still bunched in her waistband and a piece of dried grass she'd been shredding into smaller and smaller pieces. She stood up when she heard his footsteps, her hand going automatically to the post beside her, bracing, he thought, for bad news. He held up the receipt. She took it from him with both hands. Read it. Read it again. He watched her face while she did, the careful, controlled face of someone who didn't trust good news, who was reading the fine print for the thing that was going to make it not true. He can't... This voids it? She asked. Legally, yes. The debt was the basis of everything Crow had on your father. No debt, no leverage, no marriage. He paused. That doesn't mean he won't still be angry about it. He'll be furious. Yes, he'll come after you. Probably. She looked at the receipt again. Then she looked at him. Really looked. The same assessing look from before, but different now. Less calculating. More searching. Why did you do this? It was a fair question. He considered being evasive about it, then decided there wasn't much point. I saw someone who needed help, and I had the means to help them. That's most of it. That's a lot of money to spend on most of it. It is, he agreed. She turned the receipt over in her hands. What happens now? That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. He leaned against the wall of the feed mill, choosing his words with some care. Crow is going to look for ways to regain what he lost this morning. Legally, he doesn't have them, but men like Crow don't necessarily limit themselves to legal options. Staying in Ash Hollow puts you in range of that. I know that. And staying here puts you back in your father's orbit, which... He stopped. It wasn't his place to characterize her father. He tried again. Which may not be where you want to be. Elara was quiet. The wind came through the alley and moved the pins remaining in her hair. She didn't seem to notice. What are you proposing? I was heading west, he said. There's territory in the Basin country south of the Laramie Range. Not many people out that way yet, land that can be claimed under the Homestead Act. Good grass, water access. I'd planned to winter somewhere and make the move in spring. He looked at her steadily. I have some money left. Not much, not what I'd planned to have, but enough to make a start. I could use a partner in that. The word partner sat in the air between them. Partner, she said. I know what I'm asking is strange. I know we met 2 hours ago. But I also know that if you stay here, Crow is going to find a way to make your life very difficult. And your father... He stopped again. My father will do what he always does, Elara said quietly. He'll look for another arrangement. She said it without bitterness. That was what made it land the way it did. The flatness of it. The simple factual quality. The way someone talks about weather or geography. She'd had a long time to make her peace with who her father was. I'm not proposing romance, Colt said. He needed to be clear about this. This isn't that. It's practical. A homestead claim is stronger with two. Two people can work land that one person would struggle to hold. And legally, as a married woman, you'd have more standing than I'd have on my own, she finished. I know the law. Yes. You're asking me to marry you. I'm asking you to consider it as an arrangement, not the other kind. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her thinking, not just considering the proposal, but running through everything it meant. The risks, the unknowns, the considerable strangeness of the situation. She wasn't a person who made decisions carelessly. He could see that clearly. She was someone who had learned the hard way that decisions had weight, that the gap between what something promised and what it delivered could be very large. "I don't know you," she said. "No, I know almost nothing about you." "That's true. You could be—" She paused. "You could be anything." "I could," he said. "I'm not a lot of things, if that helps. I'm not a drunk. I don't raise my hand to people. I'm not particularly religious, and I don't gamble with money I don't have. A beat. I do sometimes make decisions quickly that other people would take longer on, but you might have noticed that." Something moved across her face that might, in different circumstances, have been the precursor to a smile. It didn't quite make it there, but it moved in that direction. "West," she said. "West. This basin country. How far?" 3 weeks by wagon, maybe 4 if the weather's bad." "What's out there?" "Right now? Not much, that's the point." She folded the receipt one more time and held it in both hands. He had the sense she was using it as a kind of anchor, something real in a morning that had veered sharply away from anything she'd planned. "I'd need to be able to leave," she said, "if it didn't work. If you were—" She searched for the word. "Different than you're presenting yourself." "Of course. That would need to be understood from the start." "Agreed." She looked at the alley behind him, at the edge of town visible beyond it, at the October sky, gray and wide and enormous in the way that skies only get out here, in country where there's nothing tall enough to interrupt them. "I have $17, she said, "and a carpet bag with 2 changes of clothes and my mother's quilt." "All right. I don't have a lot of experience with—" She stopped, made a small, frustrated gesture with her hand. "I've never left Nebraska. Neither of us will know what we're doing," he said. "That's the equal part." She was quiet for another moment. Then she looked at him, direct, clear-eyed, deciding. "Your horse is old," she said. "He is. We'll need a wagon." "Yes. We'll need to leave before dark." "Before noon, ideally." She straightened up. The woman who had been climbing out a church window 2 hours ago, uncertain and improvising, she was still there. He could see, underneath, but she'd gotten her feet under her. She was standing differently now. "Then we need to stop standing in this alley." He pushed off the wall. "The general store," she said. "I know where the account books are. We can get what we need and have it on paper." She stopped. "My father won't—" "I have $160 left," Colt said. "We'll buy what we need." She looked at him sharply. "That's almost nothing." "I know. You spent everything on the debt. Most of it. That's—" She stopped, started again. "Why?" He looked at her for a moment. The cracked paint on her sleeve, the half-fallen hair, the woman who had jumped out of a church window in silk and made it to the alley on a turned ankle and was now already calculating what they'd need for a 3-week journey. "Seemed like it needed doing," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, not yet. Something more careful than that. Something that was a door being left open. "All right, Colt Mercer," she said. "Let's go buy a wagon." Taunt. They left Ash Hollow before noon. There was no ceremony. There was no audience, no church, no borrowed dress. There was a county magistrate named Aldous Hicks who operated out of a converted storage room adjacent to the post office, and who agreed, for the sum of $2 and with minimal interest in the details, to sign the papers that made the thing official. It took 11 minutes. Elara signed her name in the ledger with steady hands and did not look at Colt when she did it. He signed his own name beside hers, watching the ink dry. "Well," said Aldous Hicks, who had been doing this long enough to recognize the specific flavor of a complicated situation when one walked through his door. "Congratulations to you both." Neither of them said anything. They walked out of the post office into the cold October sunlight, and their breath showed in the air as small clouds that dissipated into the larger gray of the sky. The wagon Colt had purchased, $14 from a freighter who'd needed the cash, sat in front of the general store, loaded with the things they'd decided they needed. Flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, a good axe, a coil of rope, wool blankets, medicine. The things that kept people alive when the frontier made clear it was indifferent to whether they survived. Elara had her carpet bag. Her mother's quilt was on top of the provisions. Buckwheat was hitched to the wagon, and he regarded this development with his characteristic stoicism. "Ready?" Colt asked. She looked back down the main street of Ash Hollow, at the church with its leaning tower, at the general store with Whitmore and Son painted on the sign above the door, the sun worn away almost to nothing by years of weather, at the nothing particular that waited for her in any direction this town had to offer. "Yes," she said. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, and he climbed up beside her, and they drove out of Ash Hollow, heading west into a sky that went on forever. She did not look back. "Did it?" In the church, the guests had dispersed. In the front pew, Samuel Whitmore sat alone with his hands folded in his lap and his good jacket buttoned to the neck, staring at the empty altar. In the back of the room, Silas Crow stood at the window watching the wagon disappear up the trail, and his face was the flat, still face of a man adding things to a list. In the alley behind the feed mill, a piece of dried grass lay in the dirt where Elara had left it, shredded to pieces too small to matter anymore, which was exactly what it had been good for. The church bell rang once, unanswered, and the sound died in the cold air over Ash Hollow, and the town went about its business the way it always had, and the wagon carrying Elara Whitmore and Colt Mercer grew smaller and smaller against the western sky until it became a dot, and then nothing, and then a direction without a shape. And the story that had started with a debt and address and a window that had been painted shut was only just beginning. The first night out of Ash Hollow, they didn't speak much. That wasn't unusual. Colt had spent enough time on the trail to know that the first night out of anywhere carried a particular weight, a kind of adjustment period where the mind was still catching up to the fact that the decision had been made and the road was real, and there was no comfortable reversal available. He figured Elara was somewhere in that same adjustment. He didn't push. They made camp in a shallow draw about 12 miles west of town, where a line of cottonwoods offered some wind protection and the ground was flat enough to sleep on without rolling. Colt unhitched Buckwheat and watered him from the creek that ran along the bottom of the draw, thin and cold, barely moving, the kind of creek that would freeze solid by December. He built a fire, small and smokeless as he could manage, and put coffee on. Elara sat on the wagon seat for a while, looking at nothing in particular. Then she climbed down and started going through the provisions, reorganizing the way things were packed with the quiet efficiency of someone who needed something to do with her hands. He didn't comment on the reorganizing. It made sense to reorganize. He'd packed in a hurry and the weight distribution was probably off. That was the practical explanation. The other explanation was that she'd just left everything she'd ever known, and sometimes you needed to sort flour and salt to keep from thinking about it too hard. He understood that. He'd reorganized things himself after Colorado, after Helen. It helped. She ate the beans and hardtack he made without complaint, which he noted because he'd known people, grown men, experienced trail hands, who could not face bad food gracefully. The beans were genuinely not good. He'd rushed the soaking time, and they were still slightly hard in the center. "These are terrible," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Did you soak them?" "Not long enough. 2 hours minimum, usually 4. "I know that." "Then why—" "We left in a hurry." She looked at the beans. She ate another spoonful. "Do you cook often?" "Often enough to keep myself alive." "That's not a high standard." "No," he said. "It's not." Something loosened slightly around her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of where one might eventually appear. She drank her coffee, black, too strong, because he'd also rushed that, and looked at the fire, and he looked at the fire, and the cottonwoods made their dry, papery sound in the wind above them. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said. He looked at her. "Something true." "You know more about my situation than I know about yours. That's uneven." It was a fair point. He thought for a moment. "I had a plan for that money," he said. "Before today. 40 acres north of Denver. A house on it. Not much of one, but a house. Creek access." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I'd been working toward it for about 4 years." She was quiet for a moment. "And now it's gone." "And now it's gone." "Are you angry about that?" He considered the question honestly. "No," he said. No, I'm not angry." He paused. "Ask me again in February when we're cold and broke, and the answer might be different." I'll ask you in February, she said. He looked at her. All right, he said. She set down her cup and stood up, stretching her back with a wince that told him the wagon seat had not been kind to her. I'll take the first watch, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She said it plainly, without edge. But I'd rather be useful than not. And I sleep lightly anyway. She picked up the rifle he'd leaned against the wagon wheel, his old Winchester, which she handled with a familiarity that surprised him. She saw his expression and said, My mother taught me before she died. She grew up in Kansas. She said a woman on the frontier who couldn't shoot was just a liability waiting to happen. Smart woman. She was. A pause. Get some sleep, Colt Mercer. He did. He woke at 2 a.m. to take over the watch, and she was sitting exactly where he'd left her, upright and attentive, with the rifle across her knees and her eyes moving in steady, regular arcs across the darkness around the camp. She didn't look tired. She looked like someone who had a lot to think about and had found a useful container for the thinking. She handed over the rifle without a word and went to sleep in the wagon, wrapped in her mother's quilt. He sat with the fire down to coals and listened to the wind in the cottonwoods, and somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called once and fell silent, and the night was very large and very quiet, and the road west lay ahead of them like an unfinished sentence. He thought about what he'd done that day. Not with regret. The decision had been made, and he wasn't a man who spent energy second-guessing what couldn't be changed. More with the kind of sober inventory a person takes when they've done something significant and want to understand it clearly. He had spent most of his savings on a woman he'd met an hour before. He had walked into a church full of hostile witnesses and informed the most powerful man in the county that his legal leverage was gone. He had proposed marriage, of the practical variety, to a stranger, and she had accepted, and they had driven west into an October afternoon with $146 between them and a wagon that needed new wheel bearings and a horse who was, honestly, not young. When he laid it out like that, it sounded considerably more reckless than it had felt in the moment. But he thought about the way she'd looked in that alley, say, not the desperation, which she'd been controlling carefully, but the thing underneath, the assessment. The way she'd looked at him and calculated risk with the eyes of someone who had been calculating risk her whole life and was very good at it, and was choosing to take this one anyway. That had told him something about her. People who chose carefully, who trusted their own judgment even when it was frightening to do so, those were people worth trusting in return. He was probably wrong about that. He'd been wrong before, but probably was the best you could do most of the time. The coals went orange and dim. The coyote did not call again. He kept watch until dawn came up gray and cold over the eastern hills, and when Elara climbed out of the wagon with her hair pinned and her face composed and her eyes already moving over the day's problems with that particular quality of attention she had, he was quietly, irrationally glad he'd made the decision he'd made. He didn't tell her that. It wasn't the right time for that kind of thing, and besides, he wasn't sure yet what it meant. He filed it away and made coffee that was better than the night before because he'd remembered to measure this time, and they broke camp and drove west into the morning. The first week was all Nebraska, flat and enormous and brown at that time of year, the grass cured to straw, the sky so wide it felt like a physical pressure. The trail they were following wasn't much of a trail, more of a suggestion of where wagons had gone before, a slightly flattened line through the grassland that you could lose in certain light if you weren't paying attention. Colt had been through this country before, years back, and knew the landmarks well enough to navigate by them. A particular bluff, a dry creek crossing, the ruins of a sod house that somebody had built and abandoned, and the prairie was quietly dismantling, returning it to ground. They talked more than he'd expected. Not constantly. There were long stretches of comfortable silence, which he appreciated, but in the way of people who were gradually mapping each other, learning the edges and depths. She told him about growing up in the store, about her mother who had been funny and sharp and practical, and had died of pneumonia when Elara was 14. About the years after that, running the store's accounts while her father ran the store, which meant she'd been keeping the business alive for 9 years without credit for it. About the books she'd ordered through the mail, history and geography, and one novel she'd read 4 times because it was the only one she had for 2 years. He told her about Texas, about the trail drives up to Kansas, the heat and the dust, and the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after 3 months on the trail, The way you can fall asleep in the saddle without meaning to. About Perdition, Texas, the town that didn't exist anymore. Flash flood in 1869 took out the main street and most of the buildings. The 30 families who'd lived there scattered to half a dozen other towns and never quite reassembled. About Colorado and the 40 acres north of Denver. He didn't mention Helen by name. He said he'd thought about settling before, and it hadn't worked out, and she didn't push on it, which he appreciated. She had a quality of restraint that he'd rarely encountered, a sense of where a person's boundaries were, and a willingness to respect them without making a thing of it. He figured it came from years of living closely with someone whose boundaries were all over the place in the wrong direction. When you grew up managing a difficult person, you learned other people's edges. By the end of the first week, they'd crossed into Wyoming territory, and the land began to change. The flat gave way to rolling hills, and the rolling hills gave way to the first real elevation. Not mountains yet, but the suggestion of them, ridgelines in the distance that were blue and then purple as the light changed. The temperature dropped noticeably. Frost on the wagon canvas in the mornings, their breath showing at all hours of the day now, not just in the early cold. On the 9th day out of Ash Hollow, one of the wagon's front wheels found a rut in the trail and the axle cracked. It didn't break clean through. That would have been faster and in some ways easier. It cracked about 2/3 of the way, which meant the wheel was still turning, but with a grinding, uncertain feeling that told both of them it was a matter of time. Colt stopped the wagon, climbed down, and looked at it for a while. "How bad?" Elara asked from the seat. "Bad enough that I don't want to keep going on it. Can you fix it?" He crouched down and looked at the crack. "I can splint it. It won't be as strong as it was, but it'll hold if we're careful." He looked up at her. "I need something to bind it with. The rope will work, but I'd rather have something rigid." She was quiet for a moment. Then she climbed down and started going through the provisions. She came back with the handle of the spare cookpot, a piece of iron rod about 18 inches long that he hadn't even considered as a resource. "Would this work?" she asked. He looked at it. "Yes," he said. "That'll work." It took 2 hours working in the cold with tools that were not ideal for the purpose. She held the wheel steady while he worked, and she didn't complain about the cold, and she didn't give him unsolicited advice, which, the advice part especially, he would not have predicted based on the first day's conversation, but had since come to understand was simply how she operated. She offered information when she had useful information. She was quiet when she didn't. It was a rarer quality than it should have been. When it was done, they sat against the wagon and ate cold biscuits, and she said, "We need to talk about supplies." "I know. We're going through coffee faster than I planned. I drink a lot of coffee." "You drink a catastrophic amount of coffee." She said it without inflection. "If we keep at this rate, we'll run out before we reach the basin country. We can resupply at Fort Laramie." "How far?" 4 or 5 days if the wheel holds." She thought about this. "What do we have in money?" "After the wagon repair supplies. About 130. She nodded slowly. He watched her do the calculation. Not just the coffee, but everything, estimating rates and distances and remaining needs with the ease of someone who had been managing accounts since she was 14. "It'll be tight," she said. "Yes." "But manageable." "Yes." She looked out at the hills ahead of them, the distant blue lines of the first elevation. "Tell me about the basin country," she said. "What you actually know about it, not what you hope." He appreciated the distinction. "I was through there in 71. Late spring. The basin sits at about 6,000 feet, so the winters are real, not like Nebraska real, but genuine cold and genuine snow. The growing season is shorter. Grass is good, though. Good water. 2 creeks running through the main basin and a larger river 3 miles to the south." He paused. "There were maybe 6 homesteads in the whole basin when I passed through, probably more now, but not many. How do you file the claim?" "Nearest land office is in Cheyenne. We'd have to go back to file formally, but we can establish presence first. Start building, start improving. That's what the law looks at." "And if someone else has already claimed the land you have in mind?" "Then we find a different piece. The basin's big." He looked at her. "You're already thinking about the legal structure. Somebody has to." "I was going to get to it." "When?" "Eventually." She gave him a look that contained no hostility, but a considerable amount of skepticism. "I'll handle the paperwork when we get there," she said. I know how to read land documents. All right? And you should know, I intend to have my name on the claim, not just yours. He looked at her steadily. I assumed that. Something in her posture shifted, not dramatically, but he noticed it, a fractional release of something she'd been holding in case she needed it. She'd been prepared for resistance on that point, he realized, prepared to argue for it. All right, she said. Good. They drove on. Fort Laramie was 4 days out, not 5, because the weather held and the splinted wheel did its job, and Buckwheat, whatever his other limitations, walked a very steady 12 miles a day without complaint. The fort was bigger than Colt remembered, a proper army installation now, with permanent buildings and a sutler's store and a small civilian settlement that had grown up around the edges. They resupplied, rested a day, and Colt had Buckwheat's shoes looked at by a farrier who confirmed what he'd suspected. The old horse needed new shoes and also needed to stop working quite so hard. He's got a few more years in him, the farrier said, looking at Buckwheat with the detached professional assessment of a man who had seen a great many horses. But not if you work him like he's 5. Noted, Colt said. You ought to get another horse. I know. There's a man selling a good draft mare if you're... I know, Colt said. I know I ought to get another horse. He bought the draft mare. Her name, according to the man selling her, was Agnes, and she had a boxy head and enormous feet and the broad, patient energy of an animal that had been pulling heavy things for years and had no objections to continuing. She cost $22, which was reasonable, and reduced their money to $108, which was less reasonable but would have to do. He brought Agnes back to where Elara was loading provisions onto the wagon and said, We have a second horse. Elara looked at Agnes. Agnes looked at Elara. She's large, Elara said. She's a draft. She's meant to be large. What's her name? Agnes. Elara reached out and scratched Agnes between the ears. Agnes accepted this with dignified neutrality. Hello, Agnes, Elara said, and then looked at Colt. How much did she cost? 22. That leaves us with 108. Yes. We need $108 to last until we can produce something sellable from the land, which will be spring at the absolute earliest. I know the math. Do you? Elara. I'm not criticizing. She stopped. Tried again. I'm not criticizing. I'm worried. I know. He looked at her. So am I. It was the first time he'd said that plainly, without layering it under humor or practicality, and she looked at him like she hadn't been expecting it. Are you? She said. Yes, regularly. I just don't... There's not much use in talking about it constantly when it doesn't change what we need to do. Talking about it occasionally might be useful, she said. So I know you're being realistic and not just recklessly optimistic? I was going to say performing confidence. He thought about that. That's fair, he said. I'll try to be clearer. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, she said, and there was something in it that was more than the courtesy of the words, an acknowledgement of something between them, a small piece of the territory between stranger and not stranger being crossed. They left Fort Laramie the next morning with Agnes hitched alongside Buckwheat, and the wagon moved better with 2 horses pulling it, and the miles came easier, and the mountains came closer. The mountains were a different problem. They'd been visible for days as abstract shapes on the horizon, purple and enormous, and too large to really understand from a distance. Up close, they were something else entirely. The trail climbed in long switchbacks through terrain that was no longer anything like the plains. Steep draws, loose shale, sections where the trees crowded the trail down to single wagon width, and the sky disappeared and everything was shadow and the smell of pine and the sound of their own breathing. It was in the mountains that they first encountered trouble. Not Crow, not yet. Something more immediate and less personal. On a steep downhill section 3 days into the mountain crossing, a man appeared on the trail ahead of them. He was on foot, moving slowly, and something about the way he was moving, too slow, too deliberate, made Colt pull the wagon to a stop. What is it? Elara asked. Someone on the trail. She looked. The man had stopped too, was looking at them. He was young, maybe 20, maybe younger, with trail dust thick on him and a look that Colt recognized from the far end of the road. He was used up. running on something besides actual reserves. He's sick, Elara said, or hurt, or both. They looked at each other. The calculation was obvious, and neither of them made it out loud. Taking on an unknown man in the mountains was risk, and they were already running thin on margin for additional risk. But the man on the trail was barely standing. "Go slow," Colt said. He kept the rifle across his lap as they drove forward. He stopped the wagon 20 feet from the man and looked at him directly. The young man looked back. He had brown eyes with fever in them and a cut on his forearm that had been poorly bandaged with a strip of shirt. I don't mean any trouble," he said. His voice was rough. "My horse went down 2 days ago. Broken leg." He paused. "I had to put her down myself." "Where are you headed?" Colt asked. "West. There was a homestead I was going to. My uncle's." He stopped, swayed slightly. "I know I have no right to ask. Can you sit up on the wagon?" Elara said. Both men looked at her. The young man blinked like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Colt was quiet, watching her face. "There's room in the back," she said. "We can get you to the other side of the pass. Is your uncle's place in the Basin country?" "Yes, ma'am. Silver Pine Basin." She looked at Colt, not asking permission exactly, but checking. He gave a slight nod. "Come on, then," she said to the young man. "What's your name?" "Danny," he said. "Danny Pruitt." "Get on the wagon, Danny Pruitt. You can sit with the provisions." He was too exhausted to do more than nod and climb up. His arm was infected. Elara cleaned and redressed it that evening with supplies from their medicine kit, working with a careful competence that told Colt she'd done this before. Danny Pruitt was 17, it turned out, and had left Missouri alone 3 months ago on a horse that had not been as sound as he'd been sold to believe. He was alternately grateful and embarrassed about being grateful, which Colt understood. "You did all right," Colt told him, while Elara finished with the bandage and Danny was trying to find something to look at besides his own arm. 2 days on foot in the mountains with a bad arm. That's not nothing. "My horse," Danny said. "I keep thinking about her." "I know. She was a good horse." "The good ones are always harder." He paused. "The arm will heal. You'll find another horse." It wasn't much comfort, but sometimes that was the best available, and Danny seemed to know it, because he nodded and didn't push for anything more substantial. They delivered Danny Pruitt to his uncle's homestead on the western edge of the mountain pass. A small, solid operation with a proper cabin and outbuildings. A man named George Pruitt, who came out the door when they pulled up and looked at his nephew with an expression of profound relief that he immediately covered with gruffness because he was that kind of man. He tried to press $2 on Colt and $3 on Elara, and when they both declined, he pressed food on them instead. Smoked venison and a jar of preserved peaches that were the best thing Elara had eaten since leaving Nebraska, judging by her expression when she tasted them. "You're going into Silver Pine Basin?" George Pruitt asked, watching them rehitch the horses. "That's the plan," Colt said. "Good land in there. North end of the basin near the second creek. That's the piece I'd look at. Gets more sun than the south end and the soil's better." He squinted. "Watch the Hendersons. They've got a claim on the east side and they're particular about their boundaries. We'll be careful." "You've got a good setup," George said, looking at the wagon and then at both of them with the evaluating eye of a man who'd spent enough time in frontier country to know what made a homestead work. "Two of you, 2 decent horses. Your supplies look solid. You'll be all right." He said it plainly, not as reassurance but as assessment, and Colt found he valued that more than encouragement would have been. They drove down into Silver Pine Basin in the last week of November, when the light was already thin and cold and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone bare. The basin opened out before them, maybe 6 miles across at its widest point, ringed by mountain ridges, with the grass brown and frosted and a creek line visible as a darker thread through the valley floor. It was not beautiful in the way landscapes are beautiful in paintings. It was too large and too bare and too cold for that. But it had a quality that Colt had been carrying in his mind for 2 years, a quality of possibility, the specific feeling of land that had not yet become anything, that was waiting for someone to decide what it would be. Elara sat beside him on the wagon and looked out at all of it and said nothing for a long time. "Well," she finally said. "Yeah," he said. "George Pruitt said north end near the second creek." "He did." We should look at it before the light goes. We should. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was something in that exchange that was harder to name than anything that had passed between them in 3 weeks on the road. Not the careful mapping of early days, not the functional communication of two people solving practical problems. Something with more weight than that. Something that had to do with the fact that they had crossed a mountain range together and fixed a wagon axle together and taken in a sick boy they didn't know and resupplied on $100 and arrived, against what had seemed like reasonable odds at the start of it, at the place they'd said they were going.
I didn't think we'd actually make it, she said. I thought we probably would. That's the difference between us. He almost smiled. One of them. She turned back to look at the basin. All right, she said, let's go find our creek.
He clicked to Buckwheat and Agnes and they drove down into the valley. The wagon wheels loud in the frozen grass. The mountains closing around them on all sides like a door swinging shut on everything that had come before. And Silver Pine Basin opened ahead of them, cold and brown and enormous and theirs. For now. The piece of land they chose was exactly where George Pruitt had said it would be. North end of the basin, angled toward a low ridge that caught the afternoon sun and held it longer than the flatter ground below. The second creek ran along the eastern edge of it, still moving in late November, thin but clear, cold enough to numb your hand in 10 seconds. The grass was brown and frost-killed, but you could see in the structure of it that it had been thick and good in the growing months. There were no trees close enough to be useful for lumber, which was a problem. There was a natural windbreak in the form of a long rocky outcropping to the north, which was an asset. The soil, when Colt dug down 4 inches with his boot heel, was dark and dense. Not the sandy, thin soil of the higher elevations, real soil. They stood on it in the gray November afternoon and looked at the mountain ridges around them and the creek line and the frozen grass, and neither of them said anything for a while. It's a good piece, Colt said finally. It's cold, Elara said. Yes. We don't have a structure. Not yet. She looked at him. How long to build something livable? Depends what we're building. Proper cabin. Weeks. Something that'll keep us alive through the winter. He looked at the rocky outcropping to the north. Couple days, if we use that. They used it. What they built in those first 2 days was not a cabin in any meaningful sense of the word. It was more of a lean-to structure built into the natural shelter of the outcropping. A frame of poles cut from the nearest stand of timber, a quarter-mile away, covered with the wagon canvas and chinked with whatever would hold. It was 12 feet long and 7 feet wide and 5.5 feet tall at the highest point, which meant Colt couldn't stand straight in it. The floor was packed earth. The walls were not plumb. The canvas leaked in 2 places when snow came, which it did, on the 3rd night. They put tin pots under the leaks and kept going. It was a hard winter. Not catastrophically hard. They'd prepared reasonably well, and the basin's elevation, while significant, was protected enough by the surrounding ridges that the worst of the northern storms were deflected. But hard in the way that the frontier is always hard when you are new to a place, and learning its specific rules and your margin for error is thin. They ran short on firewood twice in December because they'd underestimated how much they'd burn and overestimated how quickly they could cut and haul it. They lost 4 days in January to a storm that dropped 3 feet of snow and made travel impossible. Agnes developed a cough in February that turned out to be nothing serious but cost them a week of anxiety and some of their medicine kit. Buckwheat, who had earned his retirement several times over, continued to move at his own pace regardless of what was asked of him, which was both infuriating and, in its way, a kind of comfort. They learned each other's rhythms the way people do when they have no choice, through proximity and friction and the slow accumulation of small discoveries. He learned that she was genuinely useless in the morning before her first cup of coffee, that she had a tendency to work until she dropped rather than stop when she was tired, and that when something was bothering her, she got very quiet in a specific way that was different from her ordinary comfortable quiet. She learned that he had a short temper with mechanical things, tools that didn't work, parts that didn't fit, but enormous patience with animals and people. She learned that he rarely slept more than 5 or 6 hours, but was awake early and calm in the early morning in a way he wasn't always later in the day. She learned that he read, which she hadn't expected. He had 3 books in his saddlebag, worn to softness from handling, and he read at night when they had light and energy for it. "What are those?" she'd asked, the first time she saw him with one. He turned it to show her the cover, a history of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which she had also read. They'd spent an improbable hour that first cold evening arguing about whether Clark's maps were more valuable than Lewis's journals, which was the kind of conversation neither of them had expected to have with the other, and which left something different in the air between them. A specific kind of ease that comes from discovering someone is more than what you'd assumed. The work of the homestead was constant and rarely heroic. They cleared the building site for the actual cabin. The lean-to was always meant to be temporary. And Colt spent most of December felling and hauling timber while Elara managed the camp, the animals, the cooking, and the accounts. The accounts were her domain absolutely, and she kept them with a precision that sometimes alarmed him when she read the numbers out loud, though he appreciated knowing exactly where they stood. By February, they had $63 left, which was not comfortable but was not disaster. The cabin began to take shape in January, when the worst of the cold had passed enough to allow sustained work outdoors. It went up slowly. 2 people without a sawmill are working against time and muscle, and the logs were heavy and the fitting was painstaking, and more than once a wall section had to be taken apart and redone because the corner join wasn't tight enough to keep the wind out. Colt had built structures before, smaller ones, and he had a general competence with it. What he lacked was speed, and what they both lacked was an extra pair of hands. George Pruitt sent his nephew Danny over twice in January, once with a sledge of additional timber they hadn't asked for, and once just to help, and those 2 days moved the cabin further than the previous 2 weeks. Danny had grown 3 inches since they'd pulled him off the mountain trail, or seemed to have. The rest and food at his uncle's place had filled him out. He worked hard without being told to and didn't talk unless he had something to say, which made him excellent company. "You two planning to stay?" Danny asked, on the second day while they were fitting the roof beams. "That's the idea," Colt said. "My uncle says you're the best neighbors he's had in 4 years out here. We haven't done anything yet. He said the fact that you took me off that mountain is enough for him." Elara, who was working on the other end of the beam, said nothing, but Colt could see from the set of her shoulders that it meant something to her. He didn't comment. Some things were better left to settle on their own. They moved into the cabin in early February, which was something of an overstatement. Moved into a structure with 4 walls and a roof, and a floor that was still mostly dirt, and a fireplace that worked but smoked badly when the wind was from the southwest. But it had a door that latched and walls that didn't move in the wind and a proper wood floor in progress. And after 3 months in the lean-to, it felt, without exaggeration, like arriving somewhere. Elara stood in the middle of the main room on the first night and looked at the smoke-stained ceiling and the uneven walls and the fireplace throwing orange light across everything and said, "It's not much." "No," Colt agreed. "It's ours, though." He looked at her. She was looking at the fireplace. Her hair was down. She wore it down in the evenings when they were inside, which he'd gotten used to, and the firelight was doing complicated things with it, the way firelight does. "Yeah," he said, "it is." The days lengthened into March, and with the longer light came more work, which was almost a relief. There was land to break for a kitchen garden, fence lines to plan, a root cellar to dig, infrastructure for the animals that was more than the temporary arrangements they'd been using through the winter. The homestead was beginning to look like something from the air, a specific organized purposefulness, different from the surrounding land. That was how the territory worked. You proved your claim with improvements, and every post they sank and every furrow they turned was part of that proof. They had not talked much about Silas Crow since leaving Ash Hollow. That was partly tactical, dwelling on it didn't change anything, and partly because there had been so much immediate and demanding reality to deal with that the threat from behind had been crowded out by the necessities of right in front of them. But it was there, in the way that unresolved things are there, surfacing occasionally in a look or a question left unasked. In March, Colt went to Cheyenne to file the homestead claim. Elara had prepared the paperwork. She'd sent a letter to the land office in December requesting the appropriate forms, and had spent January filling them out with the care of someone who understood that a document filed wrong could cost you more than the land was worth. Both their names were on it. She'd checked the relevant statute 3 times to make sure it would hold. He was gone for 10 days, which was longer than expected because the early spring roads were bad, and he had some business in Cheyenne besides the land office. When he came back, he had the filed claim receipt, $42 worth of seed and small livestock, 4 chickens and a rooster, which he'd transported in a wooden crate on the wagon with a patience that impressed him. and a piece of information he didn't know how to deliver. He told her after supper when they were sitting by the fire and she had her accounts book open, and the chickens were making their small domestic sounds from their pen in the lean-to, which they'd repurposed as a barn. "I heard something in Cheyenne," he said. She looked up from the accounts. There were men in town asking questions. A rancher type, well-dressed, and 2 hands with him. He paused. They were asking about a couple who'd come west out of Nebraska, described us fairly accurately. She put the accounts book down. Crow. I don't know for certain it was his men, but the description of the man asking matched what I know of how Crow operates. He looked at her steadily. They didn't find anyone who'd talk. I made some inquiries, carefully. And the general sentiment in Cheyenne seems to be that they don't have specific information about where we've settled. But they're looking. They're looking. She was quiet for a moment. He watched the firelight move on her face, the careful internal inventory she did when she was processing something she didn't like, the stillness that preceded decision. How long do you think we have? I don't know. Long enough to get established, maybe. If we're careful about what information moves through here, if we keep a low profile with strangers, we can't stay invisible forever. No, he said. We can't. She picked up the accounts book again, then put it down again. She was doing the thing where she needed to move and was stopping herself. I'm not going back, she said. It was flat and quiet and entirely certain. If that's what you're wondering, whatever Crow sends this direction, I'm not going back to Ash Hollow. I know that, he said. I'm not asking you to. I just want that to be understood clearly. It is. She looked at him. And you? You could... She stopped, started over. Your name's on that claim, and you didn't create this situation. If Crow's men came through and it became complicated, Elara. I'm serious. You could... I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not with heat, not with the energy of someone making a dramatic declaration. Just plainly. A statement of fact. This is my land too. This is... He looked at the walls they'd built, the fireplace that smoked when the wind was wrong, the floor they'd laid plank by plank. I'm not going anywhere. She held his gaze for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Something that had been held at a careful distance for months, held there by practicality and wariness, and the very reasonable caution of a person who had been burned by trusting the wrong people. It didn't go away. But it moved. All right, she said. Then we need to talk about what we do if someone comes. It was the right question. They talked about it for 2 hours that night, not dramatically, but with the practical thoroughness they'd brought to every other problem the frontier had given them. If Crow's men came, they needed people in the basin who knew the situation and could be trusted. They needed to not be alone. George Pruitt was one resource. There were 2 other homestead families in the northern basin who they'd met briefly and whose characters seemed sound. The Aldersons, 3 miles to the west, and a widow named Mrs. Crane, who'd been in the basin for 2 years and knew everyone and everything in it with the precision of a woman who had made information her survival strategy. We need to talk to them, Elara said. Not tell them everything, but enough. People out here look after each other when they know to. Yes, Colt said. I'll go to the Aldersons tomorrow. I'll take Agnes and go see Mrs. Crane, Elara said. She'll be more useful than anyone. He almost smiled. You've assessed Mrs. Crane correctly. She came over the first week of December with a jar of venison stew and asked me 6 questions about Ash Hollow in the space of 10 minutes. She knows more about our situation than we've told her. That's slightly alarming. She's on our side, Elara said with certainty. People like that, you want them on your side. It was in April, on a day when Colt had gone to the Aldersons to help repair a fence line that a late-season elk had demolished, that the intruder came. Elara was alone at the homestead. She'd been alone before. It wasn't unusual, but she'd developed, since Colt's report from Cheyenne, a habit of keeping the Winchester within reach. She was in the barn, the lean-to that had become their animal structure, checking on Agnes, whose cough had come back mildly with the season change. She heard the horses before she saw anyone. Not the sound of a horse passing on the trail, but the specific sound of a horse being reined in, stopped, near the cabin. She picked up the rifle. She came out of the barn into the afternoon light and moved to the corner of the cabin, keeping the wall at her back. From that angle she could see the front approach without being seen from it. 2 horses, 2 men, still mounted. They were looking at the cabin, at the improvements, the fencing, the kitchen garden just starting to show green at the edges. She didn't recognize them. That didn't mean much. She stepped around the corner of the cabin with the rifle up. "Help you with something?" she said. Both men turned. They were not what she'd expected, which had been something rougher and more obviously threatening. They were trail-worn but not desperate-looking. One older, maybe 50, heavy through the middle, with the kind of beard that suggested he'd stopped bothering rather than chosen to have one. The other, younger, thin-faced, watchful. The older one looked at the rifle. "We don't mean trouble, ma'am." "I can see that," she said. "Get down off your horses." He blinked. "What?" "Get down. You're easier to assess when you're not on a horse." She kept the rifle level. "I'm not going to shoot you, but I'd like to see you clearly, and I'm more comfortable if you're not looking down at me." They got down. The older man put his hands out slightly, away from his body. A peace gesture that told her he knew the language of this kind of situation. The younger one was less practiced. He put his hands on his belt, which was too close to the holster, and she said, "Move your hands up," without changing her expression, and he did. "We're passing through," the older man said. "I'm Ned Calloway. That's my son Warren. We're looking for land in the basin. We heard it was good country." "It is good country," she said. "We didn't mean to alarm you. You rode up to an occupied homestead and sat on your horses looking at it. I wasn't alarmed. I was cautious. There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. A genuine, caught-off-guard laugh. "Fair point, ma'am. My husband's at the neighboring property," she said. "He'll be back this evening. If you're genuinely looking for land, the north end of the basin is mostly claimed, but the southwest section near the river has some good pieces that weren't filed as of March." She didn't lower the rifle until she'd finished the sentence, and then she lowered it slowly, watching both of them. "If you want to water your horses, the creek's east of the property line, about 30 feet past that fence post." "Thank you," Ned Calloway said. He seemed to mean it. "And sorry for the fright." "I told you," she said. "I wasn't frightened." He nodded, with the look of a man who had just revised an assumption. They watered their horses and rode on, and she watched them until they were over the ridge on the southwest side of the basin, and then she went back inside and sat down at the table for approximately 4 minutes. Doing nothing, because her hands had started shaking about 30 seconds after she'd lowered the rifle, and she found she needed to let them finish. They'd been strangers, and apparently honest ones, but for a few seconds when she'd heard those horses stop, before she'd moved to the corner of the cabin, the thing she'd felt was not vague anxiety, but a specific crystalline fear. Crow. His men. Everything they'd built here being undone. She'd moved anyway. She'd picked up the rifle and moved. The shaking came after, because that's when it does. When the necessary thing is finished and the body has a moment to register what it spent. When Colt came back that evening and she told him, his face went through several expressions quickly. Concern. Something close to alarm. Then a settling. "You did the right thing," he said. "They were just passing through. You didn't know that when you picked up the rifle." He looked at her. "You were alone, and you heard horses stop, and you picked up the rifle and went out." "That's exactly right." She looked at her hands, which had stopped shaking hours ago. "I was scared," she said. "Afterward. Not during, but afterward." "Yeah," he said. "That's how it works." She looked up at him. "Does it bother you that I was scared?" He looked almost confused by the question. "No," he said. "Being scared and doing what needs doing anyway, that's not a problem. That's what courage actually is. Not the absence of fear." He paused. "The shaking after means you understood what was at stake. I'd be more worried if you hadn't had it." She looked at him for a moment. He said things like that sometimes, plain, careful things that had more in them than the words suggested, and then moved on, as if he hadn't noticed the weight of what he'd just put down in the room. She was starting to understand that this was simply how he communicated important things. Quietly, without ceremony, in the middle of other conversations, so you had to be paying attention. She was paying attention. "The Aldersons," she said, moving them forward. "How's the fence?" "Fixed." He sat down at the table. "Tom Alderson wants to put together a basin association, A few of the families, regular communication, some kind of agreement about looking out for each other. That's smart. I told him we'd be interested. Good. She put the coffee on. The evening moved into its ordinary rhythms. The animals settled, supper made, accounts reviewed, and outside the spring basin was greening up, and the creek was running full and cold with snowmelt, and the mountains stood around them in the early dark like walls that were not keeping them in, but keeping certain other things out. The federal marshal arrived on a Tuesday in early May. He came alone, which was either confidence or an ambush, and he was not what either of them expected. His name was Harlan Briggs, and he was maybe 45, with a gray-streaked mustache and the road-battered quality of a man who spent more time traveling than anywhere in particular. He showed his badge at the door and asked if he could come in, which Colt found slightly surprising. Most men with badges didn't ask. He sat at their table and accepted coffee and looked around the cabin with the observational habit of someone who assessed spaces automatically. Good construction, he said. We built it this winter, Elara said. I can see that. You can tell when people build their own. There's a care to it. He drank his coffee. I'll be direct. I'm looking for a man named Cole Reardon. Goes by other names. He's wanted in 3 territories for the murder of 2 men and the robbery of a postal stage. He looked at Colt. His trail came through this basin about 3 weeks ago. Colt was very still. We haven't had anyone through here by that name. He wouldn't use the name. The marshal produced a paper. A wanted notice with a drawn likeness. He put it on the table. He's about your height, younger, brown hair, scar under his right eye from an old fight. Elara looked at the drawing. Something moved across her face. The man in March, she said quietly. Colt looked at her. There was a man who came through in March, she said to the marshal. Young, brown hair. He stopped to ask about water for his horse. I didn't see a scar. He had a hat on. She looked at the drawing again. I can't say for certain it was the same man. Which direction was he heading? Southwest. The marshal made a note. He drank more coffee. He looked at both of them with eyes that were doing considerably more work than the casual conversational tone suggested. You folks have been here since fall? Since late November, Colt said. Came from Nebraska, somebody said. A beat. That's right. Ash Hollow Way. The silence in the cabin was brief but audible. Elara's hands were still on the table. Colt kept his face level. We came through that country, he said. Marshal Briggs looked at him, then at Elara. Then he turned his coffee cup slowly in a circle, looking at it. I heard the name Crow, he said, in Cheyenne, in connection with some inquiries about a couple out of Nebraska who'd settled in this area. He looked up. I know Silas Crow, not personally, but by reputation. He's a man who uses law the way other people use a tool, picks it up when it helps him and puts it down when it doesn't. He paused. I don't take work from men like that. Colt was quiet for a moment. That's good to know. I'm telling you because you're sitting in your own house that you built yourself, and there's a kitchen garden out front, and your neighbor George Pruitt tells me you're the best people who've come into this basin in years. He set down the cup. Whatever happened in Nebraska, you've got a filed claim and an established homestead, and you're not wanted for anything in any territory I work in. He looked at Elara directly. Nobody has legal claim on you. That's how the law reads, and that's how I read it. Elara held his gaze. Thank you, she said. I just follow the law, Briggs said. The law says what it says. He stood up, put on his hat. If you do see anyone matching that drawing, I'd appreciate a message to the Cheyenne office. He moved toward the door, then stopped. The scar. It's on the right side, just under the eye. You'd see it if you saw him face on without a hat. We'll watch for it, Colt said. Briggs nodded. He went out and mounted his horse and rode southwest toward the mountains, and they watched him go from the doorway. The afternoon was warm, a real May warmth, the first of the year, smelling of grass and snowmelt, and the particular freshness of country emerging from winter. Elara leaned against the doorframe. He knew, she said. Yes. He knew the whole situation, and he came to tell us it doesn't apply here. That's what it seemed like. She was quiet for a moment. Then, there are decent people in the world. Yes, Colt said. There are.
She turned and looked at him. He was still watching the marshal's diminishing figure on the trail south, and his profile in the doorway light was... She looked away. The conversation with herself about what she felt and what she was prepared to do with it was not one she'd finished yet. She wasn't a woman who moved quickly toward things that could hurt her. She had good reason not to be. But she was beginning to understand that her careful inventory of Colt Mercer started the morning she'd run from the church and revised daily across 3 weeks of wagon trail and a hard winter and a spring of building something real from nothing. That inventory was pointing in a direction she'd been reluctant to name. She went inside and began making supper, and he came in and helped, and they ate in the warm cabin with the windows showing the long May evening, and the basin outside was alive and green, and the mountains stood in their last light, and this thing between them, whatever it was changing the way seasons change. Not in a single day, but in the accumulated weight of many days, until one morning you look up and realize something has irrevocably turned. The long winter had asked everything of them. It had been answered. And in the asking and answering, the distance between what they had agreed to be and what they were becoming had quietly, without ceremony, closed. Summer came to Silver Pine Basin the way it always does at elevation. Later than you expect, and shorter than you need, but fierce and generous while it lasts. By June, the grass was knee-high and green in a way that made the winter's brown feel like a bad dream you couldn't quite reconstruct. The creek ran full and cold and loud enough that you could hear it from the cabin porch in the mornings. The kitchen garden that Elara had started in April was producing. Not abundantly, not yet, but enough to matter. Beans, squash, the early lettuces that bolted in July heat, but were good while they lasted. She'd gotten seeds from Mrs. Crane, who had an opinion about every variety and was not shy about sharing it, and the two women had developed the kind of friendship that forms between capable people who recognize each other across a short distance and close it quickly. Colt had purchased 6 cattle in early June. Scrub stock, nothing impressive, but sound animals at a price that didn't wreck them financially. He ran them on the basin grass and spent most of July riding the perimeter of their claim, fixing the fence line, learning where the weak points were. The homestead had a shape now, a real one. Cabin, barn, root cellar dug into the hillside north of the main structure, a second small corral for the cattle separate from the horse pen. When you rode in from the south trail and crested the low ridge above the property, you could see it whole, the buildings and the fencing and the garden and the smoke from the chimney. And it looked like what it was, a place people had decided to keep. What had changed between them since May was not dramatic and not simple. It had happened in the way important things often happen, sideways, in the margins of ordinary days, in moments that only revealed their significance later. A conversation that went longer than it needed to. A hand on a shoulder that lingered a beat past practical. The evening he'd come back from the Alderson place with a bruised hand from a fencing accident, and she'd cleaned and wrapped it at the table without speaking much, and neither of them had moved away from the proximity when the wrapping was done. She had kissed him first. He noted this not because it mattered in terms of credit, but because it told him something true about who she was, a woman who, when she decided a thing, acted on the decision. It had been an ordinary evening in late May, after supper, when she'd said his name and he'd looked up from his book, and she'd looked at him for a moment with that clear-eyed directness she brought to everything. And then she'd crossed the small distance between them and kissed him with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about it for a while and was done thinking. He had not been surprised exactly, but he had been moved in a way he hadn't been moved in a long time, and he'd held that feeling carefully afterward the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping. They didn't talk about it extensively. They weren't people who needed to annotate every development between them. They had, through the winter, built a language that was mostly practical and occasionally something else. And this fell into the something else category and was left to mean what it meant without being defined into corners. What it meant, over the weeks that followed, was that the distance between them, the careful, negotiated distance of two strangers who had agreed to an arrangement, was gone. Not replaced by anything excessive or performed, but simply gone. They were two people who had chosen each other, quietly and without ceremony, out of a situation that had started as necessity and become something it hadn't been designed to be. Elara understood this better than she could articulate. She had grown up watching her father make decisions out of need and call them choices.
watching the thin rationalizations he built around things he'd simply failed to resist or prevent. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would know the difference, that she would not mistake circumstance for will. She was certain, in a way that was not romantic and not simple, that what she felt was not the residue of shared hardship. She had been through hardship with her father for years and felt nothing like this. What she felt for Colt Mercer had grown in spite of the arrangement, not because of it. In the moments when it would have been easy to remain behind the practicality, and she'd found herself unable to, because something more stubborn was in the way. She hadn't told him all of this. She told him pieces of it, in the sideways way they communicated important things, and he received those pieces with the attentiveness of someone who understood what they cost. In August, she realized she was pregnant. She knew before she said anything, gave herself 2 weeks of private certainty, which was partly caution and partly the old habit of checking everything twice before she trusted it. Then one evening, when they were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the light go off the mountain ridges in sequence the way it did this time of year, she told him. He went very still. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes?" He looked at the mountains. He was quiet for long enough that she felt the first edge of worry. Not about what he felt, but about the gap between what he felt and what he'd be able to say. "Colt, I'm here," he said. "I'm thinking." "About what specifically?" He turned to look at her. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working through something real. Not performing calm, not performing anything, just the actual internal process showing through in small ways. "I'm thinking about winter, whether the cabin's warm enough, whether we're far enough from Cheyenne to get help if something goes wrong, whether we need to get a cow for milk." He paused. "I'm thinking that this is—" "You don't have to find the right words," she said. "I want to. I know, but you don't have to." She looked at him steadily. "Are you glad?" He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, something that had been behind the thinking, waiting for the question to open it. "Yes," he said. It came out quiet and entirely sincere. "Yes, I am." She reached over and put her hand over his on the porch rail. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that while the light left the mountains and the first stars appeared above the eastern ridge, and the creek made its sound in the dark below the property, and the cattle moved slowly in their pasture, and the basin settled into night around them, and neither of them spoke for a while because there wasn't anything to say that the moment hadn't already said more clearly. It was in September that Silas Crow's shadow fell across Silver Pine Basin for the last time. Colt had gone north to buy cattle, 2 more animals from a rancher named Whitfield who ran a small operation at the top of the basin and had surplus stock he was willing to sell at a fair price. He'd planned to be gone 2 days. Elara had the homestead, the animals, Agnes and Buckwheat in the pen, the Winchester on its hook by the door. George Pruitt had said he'd check in the second morning, which was the arrangement they'd had since spring. The rider came on the first afternoon. Not 2 riders, not a group. 1 man, alone, on a good horse that had been ridden hard. He came from the south trail, the direction of the mountain pass, and he pulled up outside the fence line and called out before coming through the gate, which told Elara something. She came to the cabin door with the rifle not raised, but in her hand. He was not one of Crow's men. He was younger than she'd expected anyone connected to this situation to be, maybe 25, with a thin face and dusty clothes and the look of a man who had been riding fast for a specific reason. "Mrs. Mercer?" he said. She looked at him. "Who's asking?" "My name's Frank Alderton. I ride for Marshal Briggs out of Cheyenne." He reached into his jacket slowly, watching the rifle, and produced a folded paper. "He asked me to bring this to you personally." She came forward, took the paper through the fence rail without opening the gate, and stepped back. She read it with the rifle still in her right hand, the paper in her left. It was a letter from Harlan Briggs, dated 4 days prior. His handwriting was cramped and practical. He wrote that Silas Crow had arrived in Cheyenne 10 days ago, in person, with a lawyer from Kansas City. That Crow had made inquiries at the land office regarding the Mercer claim and had been informed that the filing was legitimate and complete and not subject to challenge on any grounds he'd presented. That Crow had then approached Briggs directly and attempted to engage him in what Briggs described, without specific elaboration, as a line of work I don't do. that Briggs had declined, that Crow had spent 3 days in Cheyenne making additional inquiries before departing south. The last paragraph read, "I am writing to tell you that the man's legal options in this matter are, in my professional assessment, exhausted. A paid debt cannot be reinstated. A filed claim cannot be voided by a private party's displeasure. He has no standing in any court I know of. What he has is persistence, which is a different problem, and one I cannot solve for you from Cheyenne. But I want you to have the full picture. You deserve to know exactly where you stand." She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands, looking at the writer. "Briggs sent you yourself," she said. "He didn't use the post. He said the post takes 3 weeks, and he figured you'd want to know sooner." She looked at the folded letter. She thought about Silas Crow in a Cheyenne lawyer's office in his Kansas City suit, his iron gray hair well kept, his large hands folded on a desk, presenting his case to men who had looked at the filing and told him there was nothing there. She thought about what that had cost him, not in money, but in something he valued more, the certainty that he was a man who got what he decided to have. She thought about the church in Ash Hollow with its leaning tower, the borrowed dress with the pearl buttons, the window she'd pried open with a letter opener. "Thank you," she said to the writer. "Can I offer you water, coffee?" "Water would be good, ma'am, thank you." She let him water his horse at the creek and gave him coffee anyway, and he drank it standing in the yard and told her a little about Briggs, that he'd been a marshal for 15 years, that he was honest in the way some men are honest because they've thought it through and decided it's what they're going to be, rather than because it comes naturally. She found she appreciated knowing that. It mattered, the distinction between people who were good by default and people who chose it on purpose. The writer left an hour before dark, heading back south toward the pass. She stood on the porch and watched him go, and then stood there a while after he'd gone, in the September evening that smelled of cured grass and the first hint of the cold coming, and she held the letter and thought. What she felt was not entirely relief. There was relief in it, but there was also something more complicated. The recognition that Crow was not finished because he'd been legally defeated. He was finished, if he was finished, because he'd run out of avenues and because men like Briggs wouldn't work for him and because the claim was solid and the homestead was established and there was nothing left to pull on. That was not the same as gone. It was more like neutralized, a threat reduced to the level of weather. Still present, still capable of damage in the right circumstances, but no longer aimed. She could live with that. She'd lived with worse. She was inside starting supper when she heard Colt's horse on the trail, the specific rhythm of Buckwheat's walk that she'd have recognized anywhere by now, slightly uneven on the left foreleg, stubbornly consistent. And a few minutes later he came through the door with his hat off and trail dust on him, and she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it standing at the table. She watched his face go through its quiet process. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at her. "Briggs sent a rider," she said. "I can see that. He came this afternoon. He'd ridden hard from Cheyenne." Colt was quiet for a moment. "Crow's out of options." "Legally, yes. But he's still Silas Crow," she said. "That doesn't disappear because a land office told him no." "No," Colt agreed. "It doesn't." He sat down at the table. He looked at the letter again, not reading it, just looking at it. "What do you want to do?" She thought about how to answer that. What she wanted was complicated and various, and some of it was not about Crow at all. "I want to stop waiting for him," she said finally. "I want to stop organizing our life around the possibility of him. The Basin Association, the relationships with Briggs and George and the Aldersons, those are good things, and I want to keep them because they're good, not because they're defense." She looked at him. "I want this to be our life, not a position we're holding." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a different way to think about it. Is it wrong?" "No?" He shook his head. "No, that's exactly right." He paused. "You've thought about this?" "I've been alone with it all afternoon. I had time to think." He almost smiled at that. Then his eyes went to her middle. The visible change that was still subtle but real now, 6 weeks on from when she'd told him. And something in his face did the thing it did when he looked at her now, the thing that was harder to name than what his face had done before in the early months. Something that was both steadier and more exposed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Today, with the rider?" "I'm fine. I wasn't frightened." "You can be frightened and fine." "I know that," she said. "I learned it from you." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "I wasn't frightened," she said again, quieter. "I was ready. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. He understood the difference. He'd spent enough years in situations where fear was the correct response and forward motion was the only option, where you couldn't afford to let the fear be in front of you, only behind, pushing. She'd learned that. She'd learned it in one winter in this basin, in a lean-to that leaked, defending a homestead she'd helped build with her own hands against whatever the frontier sent. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Elara," he said. "Don't make it ceremonial," she said. He almost laughed. "I'm not going to make it ceremonial." He turned her hand over and held it properly. "I just want to say what you said about this being our life, not a position we're holding." He looked at their hands. "That's right. Yes. That's what I want too." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I know that, Colt." Supper was late because of the conversation, and they ate it when the cabin was fully dark outside and the fire was the main light, and Mrs. Crane's preserved peaches made an appearance because Elara had decided, with the letter folded on the table between the dishes, that this was a night that warranted preserved peaches. Colt ate 2 portions without comment, which she took as agreement. After supper, he read and she wrote a letter to the land office in Cheyenne, requesting specific information about the additional acreage adjacent to their north fence line, which she'd been thinking about since July. Whether it was available, what the filing requirements were, how a homestead extension was documented. She wrote in the careful, precise language of someone who had learned that documents filed correctly were a form of power available to people who had no other kind. When she set down this pen, Colt looked up from his book. "What are you writing?" "A letter to the land office." "About what?" "The acreage north of our fence line." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to expand the claim." "If the land's available, yes. We're going to need more pasture when the herd grows." She looked at him. Do you object?" "No," he said. "I was just thinking we'd need another fence line." "We'll need a lot of things," she said. "The baby will need—" She stopped, then continued. "We'll need another room on the cabin. Before winter." He looked at the wall to the east, the logical direction for expansion, where the ground was flat and the cabin's structure would support an addition. She could see him building it in his head, the way he did with physical problems, the sequence, the materials, the order of operations. "October," he said. "If we start in October, we'll have it weathered in before the first hard freeze." "That's what I calculated." He looked at her. "Did you already draw up plans?" She opened the accounts book to the back pages, where she'd sketched a rough floor plan. The existing cabin, the proposed addition, the measurements based on what lumber they had, and what they'd need to buy. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at her. "You've been busy," he said. "I had a quiet summer," she said, which was so far from the truth that it was almost a joke. And he knew it. And the thing that moved across his face was warm and genuine and better than a smile, which was a thing she'd come to know about him. That his face did more interesting things than smile, and she'd learned to read them. She closed the accounts book. Outside, the September night was enormous and cold and full of stars. The basin's elevation put them closer to the sky than felt entirely natural, the stars too bright and too numerous. The Milky Way a genuine presence overhead rather than a suggestion. The creek moved in the dark below the property line. Somewhere out in the pasture, one of the cattle made a low sound and was quiet again. Inside, the fire settled and the lamp on the table made its small circle of warm light, and the letter from Marshal Briggs sat folded on the table with Silas Crow's best legal options spent inside it, and Elara Whitmore, Elara Mercer, though she still sometimes thought of herself by both names, the old and the new sitting alongside each other like the before and after of a single continuous person, sat in her own cabin that she had helped build and thought about the north acreage and the room addition and the spring that was coming and the life that was coming with it. She was 24 years old. She had jumped out of a church window and crossed a mountain range and built a house in winter and faced down strangers with a rifle and kept accounts through a season that should have broken them and hadn't. She was not the woman who had stood in the cracked mirror of that leaning church 8 months ago, looking at a future that had been decided by other people's failures and other people's greed. She was not sure yet exactly who she was becoming, but she could feel it, the shape of it, accumulating day by day, the way a structure accumulates when people put their hands to it and refuse to stop. Colt put down his book and banked the fire for the night, and they went to sleep in the cabin they'd built in the middle of a basin that was theirs, and the stars turned overhead in the enormous Wyoming dark. And somewhere far to the east, in a town with a leaning church tower and a store with a faded sign, Silas Crow sat with his spent leverage and his Kansas City lawyer and the particular fury of a man who had finally run out of road. And it was no longer Elara's problem. Not entirely. Not in the way it had been. But close enough. The room addition went up in October, the way Colt had said it would. It was not a beautiful process. It was cold work. The kind of cold that gets into your knuckles and stays there. That makes you fumble tools and lose feeling in your fingertips and have to stop every hour to warm your hands over a fire you've built specifically for that purpose. The lumber cost more than they'd budgeted because the supplier in the closest settlement had figured out that people building before winter were not in a position to negotiate aggressively. Colt paid it without much argument, which told Elara more about where his priorities had settled than any conversation could have. Danny Pruitt came for 3 days, same as he had with the original cabin. He was 18 now and nearly as tall as Colt, and considerably more talkative than he'd been in the winter, with opinions about everything from the proper way to notch a corner joint to the political situation in the territorial legislature, which he'd been reading about in a newspaper his uncle received 3 weeks late by mail. Elara found him useful and exhausting in roughly equal measure, which was about right for 18. "You ought to put a window on the east wall," Danny said on the second morning, looking at the framing. "Get the morning light." "Windows cost money," Colt said. "Morning light's free." Colt looked at Elara. She looked at the east wall. "He's not wrong," she said. "They put in a window on the east wall. It cost $11 and was worth considerably more than that in February, when the morning light came through it and made the room feel like something other than a place you were surviving. The room was finished, walls, floor, roof, window, and all, by the last week of October, 2 weeks before the first real snow. It was 12 feet by 10 feet, which was not large, but it was real and solid and warm. And Elara stood in it on the first evening after the door was hung and looked at the window that faced east and thought about the child who would sleep in this room and grow up looking at mountains through that glass every morning of their life. And she felt something so large and various that she couldn't find a single name for it and stopped trying. Colt came to stand beside her. He looked at the window too. "Good call on the east wall," he said. "It was Danny's call." "You agreed with it." "I agreed with it." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "About the spring, the baby." She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider things anymore. "Yes," she said. "Some. The nearest doctor is in Laramie City, which is too far if something goes wrong." She paused. "Mrs. Crane has delivered babies. She's done it 7 times, she told me. She knows what she's doing." "That's not the same as a doctor." "No," Elara said. "It's not, but it's what we have." She looked at him. "Are you frightened?" He took slightly too long to answer, which was itself the answer. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we're both being realistic." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She leaned against his arm, not dramatically, just resting there. And they stood in the new room in the lamplight and the cold that was coming through the not quite settled doorframe, and outside the October basin was brown again under a sky that meant business, and neither of them pretended it was all going to be simple. That was the thing she'd come to understand about Colt Mercer across a year of knowing him. He didn't make things easier by lying about them. He made things manageable by being honest about what they were, and then staying anyway. That was rarer than it should have been. She knew that better than most people. November brought snow and the Basin Association's first formal meeting, held at the Alderson place because Tom Alderson had the largest main room. 7 families attended. The Aldersons, the Mercers, George and Danny Pruitt, Mrs. Crane, a newer couple named Beaumont, who'd come in from Colorado in August, and an older man named Gus Halverson, who'd been in the basin longer than anyone and attended every meeting and never said much but whose presence meant something, the way the presence of an old tree in a field means something. They talked about the winter, coordinating firewood, checking on each other during storms, the practical infrastructure of neighbors. They talked about the spring cattle drive. Pooling stock for the trip to the railhead at Laramie City made more sense than going separately, lower risk and better negotiating position on price. They talked about a school, which was Mrs. Crane's agenda item, in which she presented with the focused determination of a woman who had decided this was happening and was informing the group rather than asking it. "We have 9 children in this basin between us," she said, looking around the room. "In 2 years it'll be more. A school requires a building, a teacher, and a budget. I've written to the Territorial Education Office about funding. I need 2 people to help me write the formal petition." Elara said, "I'll help with the petition." Mrs. Crane looked at her with the expression of someone who had already counted on this but was glad to have it confirmed. "Good," she said. "We'll start after Christmas." On the ride home through the snow, Colt said, "You didn't hesitate on the petition." "I write documents for a living," Elara said, which was a slight overstatement, but not by much. "And children in this basin deserve a school, including ours." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily through the snow, Agnes breaking trail with her enormous patient feet, Buckwheat following with his particular dignified shuffle. The basin was white and still, and the sky was the flat gray of deep winter coming. "I've been thinking about Ash Hollow," Colt said. She looked at him. "What about it?" "Your father." He paused. Whether you've thought about writing to him." She had thought about it. She'd thought about it more than she'd told him, turning it over in quiet moments, in the same way you turn over something with a sharp edge, carefully, looking for the angle that doesn't cut. "I think about it," she said. "I haven't decided." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She watched Agnes's shoulders moving through the snow ahead of her. "He's not a cruel man. He's a weak one. Those are different things, and I've spent a long time being angry at him for the wrong one." She paused. "He made a terrible decision. He made it because he was afraid and didn't see another way. That doesn't excuse it." Another pause. "But the baby is going to be his grandchild. And I don't want to be someone who holds things past the point where holding them still makes sense." Colt said nothing. He had the quality of listening that good listeners have, the kind that doesn't fill silences with reassurance or opinion, that lets the other person find the end of their own thought. "I'll write to him," she said, "after the baby comes, when there's something to tell." "All right. Don't tell me it's the right thing." "I wasn't going to." "Good," she said. "I'm not doing it because it's right. I'm doing it because I'm tired of carrying it." He looked at her. "That's honest." "I try to be." "I know," he said. "It's one of the more inconvenient things about you." She looked at him sharply and found him looking ahead with the expression that meant he was amused and trying not to show it. She said nothing. But the thing that moved through her chest was warm and complicated, and very much the opposite of the thing she'd felt in the cracked mirror of the Ash Hollow Church a year ago. And she cataloged the difference carefully, the way she cataloged everything, because it mattered to know exactly where you were. The baby came in late July of the following summer. It was not a smooth process. She'd known enough to expect that. Mrs. Crane had been candid with her in the months leading up to it, which Elara had appreciated even when the information was alarming. Knowledge was always better than the alternative. She'd spent the last month making sure everything was in order: the room, the supplies, Mrs. Crane on call, Colt with instructions about what to do and what not to do, the second of which was the longer list. Labor started on a Tuesday evening and ran through Wednesday. That was the part nobody had been able to prepare her for fully. The duration, the way time became something different during it, elastic and unreliable. Mrs. Crane was there through all of it, steady and practical and occasionally profane in a way that was oddly comforting. Colt was in the main room, on the other side of the door, and she could hear him sometimes, the sound of his boots when he stood up and paced, which was frequent, and the sound of him sitting back down, and once the sound of something being set down harder than he'd meant to, which told her everything about how the waiting was going for him. She did not call for him. She was going to do this the way she did everything, straight through. But she was aware of him there on the other side of that door, and it was not nothing. It was in fact considerable. The boy arrived on Wednesday afternoon. He was small and red-faced and extremely loud about his opinions on the situation, which Mrs. Crane said was a good sign with the efficiency of someone filing a report. He had a full head of dark hair, Elara's hair, and large hands that were already, improbably, Colt's hands in miniature. He was, in the objective assessment available to his mother approximately 45 seconds after his arrival, the most significant thing that had ever happened. Mrs. Crane opened the door and told Colt he could come in. He came in slowly, the way people move when they're afraid of their own reaction to something. He stood at the side of the bed and looked at Elara first, the real look, the one that checked everything. And she said, "I'm fine. Stop looking at me like that and look at him." He looked at the boy. Whatever was on his face in that moment, she watched it happen, and she didn't have words for it, and she didn't try to find them. Some things are better preserved without language. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the boy in his arms, and he held him with the careful, slightly terrified competence of a man doing something for the first time that he understands he cannot afford to get wrong. "He's very small," Colt said. "He'll grow. He sounds angry. He has opinions," Elara said. "He gets that from somewhere." Colt looked at her. Something in his face broke open in the best way. The careful, self-contained quality he'd always had. The distance he kept even in closeness, giving way to something that had no defenses. His eyes were bright in a way she'd never seen before. She didn't mention it. She didn't need to. They named him James Samuel Mercer. James because it was a name neither of them had any complicated history with. Samuel because Elara had written to her father in the spring and received, 3 weeks later, a letter that was not enough and not nothing. A letter full of the particular inadequate language of a man who knew he'd done wrong and couldn't quite bring himself all the way to accounting for it. She'd read it twice and filed it away. Samuel was not forgiveness. It was a door left slightly open, which was all she could honestly offer. Her father replied to the birth announcement in September with a letter that was better than the first. He said he'd been sober since April, which she received with caution because she'd heard that before, but also with the small internal noting of a woman who had decided to stop organizing her feelings around her father's decisions and start simply watching what happened. He sent a quilt he'd had made, not as fine as her mother's, but made with intention, which counted for something. She wrote back. Shorter than his letter, but she wrote back. The fall was full in the way that falls are full on a working homestead. Cattle to bring in from the summer pasture, the garden to put to bed, firewood to stock, the endless maintenance of structures that the winter would test. James, who was by September attempting to form opinions about everything within his field of vision, supervised from a blanket in the yard or from the carrier that Elara had fashioned from wool, and which Colt wore with the stoic practicality of a man who had decided that self-consciousness was a luxury he couldn't afford when there was work to do. Danny Pruitt, who came around more than could be explained by neighboring, held James one afternoon in September and announced with the solemnity of a young man making an important determination that he was a good baby. "He cries a lot," Colt said. "That's how you know he's good," Danny said with the complete confidence of someone who had no particular basis for this claim. "The quiet ones are the worrying ones." Elara, who was mending harness 20 feet away, said nothing but stored this in the category of things Danny said that were probably wrong but not worth arguing about. It was in November. The basin dusted with the first proper snow of the season, the mountains white above the brown valley floor, the air with that particular stillness that precedes real winter. That Silas Crow made his final appearance in the story of Elara and Colt Mercer. He did not appear in person. He appeared in the form of a letter, forwarded from the Cheyenne Marshal's office through George Pruitt, who brought it on a gray morning with the expression of a man who wasn't sure what he was carrying. Colt read it first. Then he handed it to Elara without comment and watched her face while she read. It was from a lawyer in Omaha, not the Kansas City lawyer, a different one. It informed them that Silas Crow had suffered a significant stroke in early October and was now incapacitated, confined to his property near Ash Hollow, and no longer able to conduct his business affairs personally. The letter, written on behalf of Crow's estate manager, stated that all outstanding matters Crow had been pursuing in the Wyoming and Nebraska territories were hereby considered closed. The language was legal and bloodless and final. She read it twice. She put it down on the table. She looked at the window, the east window, the one Danny had suggested, the one that showed the mountain ridge going white with morning snow. "Well," she said. "Yeah," Colt said. George Pruitt, who was sitting at their table with his hat in his hand, said quietly, "I'm sorry if that's... I wasn't sure whether that was good news or..." "It's neither," Elara said. "It's just news." She looked at it again. He was a bad man who did bad things, and the bad things don't disappear because he's ill. She paused. "But they don't follow us anymore either." George nodded. He was a man who understood the difference between resolution and justice, which were two different things that people often confused. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on. "I'll leave you to it then." After he left, the cabin was quiet except for James, who was asleep in the new room with the morning light coming through the east window and falling across him in that particular way that made Elara stop whatever she was doing and look, every time, without meaning to. Colt sat at the table. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I feel like I want to go check on the baby," she said. "And then I want coffee. And then I want to work on the school petition with Mrs. Crane, because she's been waiting on my edits for 2 weeks." She paused. "That's how I feel." He looked at her. "Elara, I know what you're asking," she said, "and I'm telling you the truth. I feel like a door that was open is now closed. I didn't realize how much air it was letting in until it shut." She looked at the letter on the table. "I'm not glad he's ill. I'm not sorry either. She searched for it. Finished with it. I'm finished with it." He nodded slowly. "Are you?" she asked. He thought about it. Genuinely thought the way he did, without hurrying. "I spent $2,000 on a situation I walked into sideways," he said. "I've had a year to figure out whether I regret that." He looked at her. "I don't. Not the part that matters." He paused. "The 40 acres in Colorado, the house I'd planned. Yeah, sometimes I think about what that might have been." He said it honestly, without apology. "But I think about it the way you think about a road you didn't take. You wonder, but you don't actually want to go back." "Bo tastet." She held his gaze. "Because of this," she said. Not a question. "Because of this," he said. "Because of you. Because of him." He nodded toward the room where James was sleeping. "Because of..." He gestured, a slight imprecise movement that meant the cabin and the basin and the window and the creek and the cattle and the school petition and Mrs. Crane and the Aldersons and everything accumulated over a year of making something real. All of it. She got up from the table and kissed him. The same deliberateness as the first time in late May of the year before, except that now it was simply part of the language they used with each other. And he put his hand against her face the way he did. And they stood in their kitchen in the morning light with the letter from Omaha on the table and the baby asleep in the next room and the snow coming down outside. And it was not a perfect moment because perfect moments don't exist, but it was a true one. And true was better. That winter was hard, same as the first, because the frontier is not a place that grants exemptions for anything you've been through before. The cold was real, and the work was constant, and James had opinions about both that he communicated without restraint. The cabin needed re-chinked on the north wall. Agnes developed another cough, same as the year before, which resolved the same way. The firewood supply ran short by 3 weeks in February, which sent Colt out in weather that was not reasonable for travel. And when he came back half frozen with a sledge of pine he'd bought from the Beaumonts, Elara said nothing but made him sit by the fire and brought him coffee, and did not mention that she'd been managing her anxiety about his absence for 6 hours by reorganizing the provisions. He looked at the reorganized provisions and looked at her and said, 6 hours? 5.5, she said. He drank his coffee. The pine is green, she said. It'll smoke. I know it's green. You paid full price for green pine? It was the only pine available within 5 miles. She looked at the sledge and then back at him. It was a bad situation well handled, she said, which was as close to an unconditional compliment as she was capable of in the direction of a decision she had reservations about, and he understood this and said thank you, without pushing for more. Spring came eventually, same as it always does, indifferent to how long the winter took. March brought mud. April brought the creek running full and the first green on the south-facing slopes, and James, who had spent the winter mastering the arts of sitting and making his needs known at volume, beginning to pull himself along surfaces with an expression of complete self-satisfaction. May brought the school petition approval from the Territorial Education Office. Mrs. Crane received this news with the composure of someone who had not doubted the outcome, but was nevertheless gratified to have it confirmed. Elara, who had written and revised and filed the formal documents over 4 months of work, allowed herself a specific quiet satisfaction that she shared with no one except Colt, who had read the final version and said it was the clearest piece of advocacy he'd ever encountered, which she'd filed away in the same place she kept other things, he said, that meant more than they were supposed to. It was in the autumn of that second full year. James, almost 14 months old, the cattle herd grown to 11. The north acreage filed and the fence line extended, the school building under construction at the center of the basin with lumber that 6 families had pooled to buy, that Colt asked her to renew their vows. He did not make a production of it. That was not who he was. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, watching the autumn stars come out above the eastern ridge, the same stars they'd watched from this same porch through 2 winters and 2 summers. The same stars that had been overhead the night they'd driven into the basin for the first time, cold and broke and unsure of nearly everything. James was inside, asleep, in the room with the east window. Colt said, "I've been thinking about something." "You think about things constantly," she said. "What specifically?" "The papers we signed," he said, "in Ash Hollow, in Aldous Hicks's storage room." She looked at him. "They were the right papers," he said. "They did what they needed to do. But we signed them fast and it was—" He stopped, started again. "I'd like to do it again. Here, in front of people we actually know." He paused. "If you want to." She looked at the stars. She thought about Aldous Hicks's storage room with the bay rum smell and the scratched ledger and the 11 minutes it had taken to make the arrangement official. She thought about how she'd signed without looking at Colt because she was still figuring out who he was and what she'd agreed to. She thought about who she was now, standing in this specific life, and what she would sign with her eyes open. "Who would we invite?" she asked. "George and Danny, the Aldersons, Mrs. Crane." He paused. "The Beaumonts, if they want to come. Harlan Briggs, if he's ever through this way again." That's not many people. It's the right people. She thought about that. The right people. After a life of living in a town full of people who watched a woman be sold at an altar and said nothing, she'd spent 2 years building a community of people who would ride through a snowstorm to bring you green pine. The distinction mattered immensely. "All right," she said. "All right?" "Yes, Colt. All right." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What do you want to say? When we do it?" She thought. "The truth," she said. "Whatever's true." "That's a short ceremony." "Long enough," she said. It happened on a Saturday in late October, in the yard of the Mercer homestead, with the mountains going gold and the basin grass brown gold beneath them, and 11 people standing in the afternoon light. Mrs. Crane had brought preserved peaches and a venison roast that had been cooking since morning. The Alderson children ran around the perimeter of the yard in the way children do at events they don't fully understand but can feel the weight of. There was no officiant. George Pruitt said a few words because someone needed to start, and his words were plain and genuine and not long, which was correct. Then Colt said what was true, that he'd made a reckless decision on an October morning with no particular plan and no idea where it was going, and that every day since had argued in favor of it, that he'd built this place with someone he'd chosen and who had chosen him back, and that choosing and being chosen by Elara Whitmore Mercer was the most significant thing he'd ever done, and he intended to keep doing it. Elara said what was true, that she'd run from a church in a dress that didn't belong to her, and trusted a stranger in an alley, and crossed a mountain range on a cracked axle, and that at no point had she been certain it was the right decision. That certainty, she'd learned, was not the point. That you made the decision with what you had, and then you stayed, and the staying was where the meaning was. That she had stayed and would keep staying, and that the man standing in front of her had earned, quietly and without ceremony, and through the long, hard work of a shared life, every piece of her trust. James, who was being held by Danny Pruitt and had been fed and was therefore in a cooperative mood, observed the proceedings with the grave interest of someone who did not understand the occasion but recognized that it mattered. Afterward there was food and the preserved peaches and the Alderson children chasing each other in the last light. And Mrs. Crane told an extremely long story about a land dispute from 3 years ago that somehow had a funny ending, and George Pruitt and Colt talked about the spring cattle drive, And Elara stood at the edge of the yard with James on her hip and looked at the mountains in the last of the day's light and let herself feel the full weight of the moment without managing it or categorizing it or filing it away. This was her life. Not the life she'd been handed by debt and fear and other people's failures. Not the arrangement she'd agreed to in a storage room while her hands were steady and her heart was somewhere she hadn't decided yet. This life, the one she'd built plank by plank and fence post by fence post and document by document, the one she'd defended with a rifle and argued into existence with a petition and chosen, every day, with the full knowledge of what it was. The mountains went dark, one ridge at a time, the way they always did, and the stars came out above Silver Pine Basin, and inside the cabin the fire was lit, and the east window showed light, and the people who had come to witness something went home through the cold evening, and Colt came to stand beside her at the edge of the yard, and she leaned against him without ceremony, and James put one small hand on his father's chest in the absolute, uncomplicated trust of a child who has never had any reason to feel otherwise. The frontier had not been kind. It had been honest, which was different and harder, and worth considerably more in the long run. It had asked everything of her and given everything back in a different shape. Not the life she'd imagined or hoped for, but something better than hoped for, something real, with weight and texture and the specific dignity of things that have been earned. She thought about the woman in the cracked mirror. She thought about the letter opener and the painted shut window. She thought about the alley behind the feed mill and a man sitting on a crate who'd said, "Give me 1 hour," with the calm recklessness of someone who had no idea what he was starting. She was glad he'd said it. She was glad she'd waited. Some stories begin with escape. This one had. But the escape had only ever been the first sentence. Everything that followed, the miles, the winter, the walls they'd built, the arguments they'd had and resolved, the child asleep in the next room, the people gathered in this yard, the school going up at the center of the basin, the north acreage filed and fenced, the life that was larger and more complicated and more hers than anything she'd been offered before, all of that was the story itself. The frontier had given her one thing above everything else, the knowledge that a life is not something that happens to you. It is something you make, badly and imperfectly, and with whatever is in your hands at the time, until the day you look at what you've made and find that it is, despite everything, exactly enough. James fell asleep against his father's shoulder. The stars were very bright, the basin was quiet, and the fire burned in the cabin, and the east window held its light, and Elara Mercer was home.